As I bent down to grab a glass, I felt Michael's gaze fixed on me, watching in a way that made my heart pound. When I stood up and met his eyes, his stare remained, holding mine with a depth that took me by surprise. "You have no idea what you're doing to me," he murmured, his voice low and serious. The room seemed to shrink, the atmosphere grew heavier, and I found myself unsure whether to look away or move closer. In that instant, I realized that things were about to shift, though I wasn't certain if I was prepared. It had been an exhausting day, one of those long afternoons where I was counting the minutes until I could collapse into bed. My husband had invited a few friends over for drinks and a game, and while I didn't mind, I wasn't really in the mood for company. The living room was full of laughter and conversation, blending with the television's hum as I quietly moved around the kitchen, tidying up. I didn't mind keeping to myself, letting them enjoy their night, but I could sense one particular pair of eyes following me more than the others. It wasn't my imagination, I could feel it every time I passed by, every time I moved. Michael, my husband's friend, had always been polite and friendly, the kind of person who knew how to blend in without causing much of a stir. But tonight felt different. His eyes followed me in a way that made his conversations falter slightly whenever I entered the room, as though I was distracting him in ways he couldn't articulate. I didn't know why, but the air around me felt thick, laden with a tension I couldn't quite pinpoint. I tried to ignore it, focusing on my chores, but the weight of his gaze was undeniable. Every time I bent down or reached for something, I could feel him watching. At first, it was subtle, easy to dismiss as my imagination, but as the evening wore on, it became clear. He wasn't looking at me like a friend's husband's friend should. There was more to it, something more intense that sent a warm flush to my cheeks, though I wasn't sure if it was from embarrassment or something else entirely. As the night progressed, the laughter began to fade as the game ended. My husband was outside fixing something on the patio, leaving just Michael and me inside. I was bent over, picking up a few stray glasses from the coffee table when I heard his voice, quiet and close, more than I expected. "You don't even realize how beautiful you look like that," he murmured, almost to himself, though I knew those words were meant for me. I froze, my hand gripping the glass, breath caught in my throat. The air between us shifted, crackling with the intensity that had been simmering all night. Something we hadn't acknowledged but both felt. Slowly I straightened, turning to face him. "Michael," I began, unsure of what I wanted to say, words stuck somewhere between disbelief and curiosity. He was closer now, just a few feet away, his eyes locked on mine with a look that was both gentle and searing, as though seeing me in a way he hadn't before. His stare was intense, filled with something that made my pulse race, and I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks again. The room seemed to close in, the air thickening, and for a moment I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to step back, break the spell weaving itself between us, but another part of part one didn't know existed, didn't want to move at all. "You've always been beautiful," he said quietly, his voice softer now, more intimate. "But tonight, I don't know, there's something different about you." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning, and I swallowed hard, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what was happening. This wasn't right, was it? He was my husband's friend, this shouldn't be happening. Yet, as he stepped closer, his hand brushing lightly against mine as he reached for one of the glasses, I felt a spark of something I hadn't felt in a long time, something I didn't want to admit was there. "Michael, we can't," I whispered, barely audible, though I wasn't even sure what I wanted to say, or if I believed the words I was trying to speak. But he didn't pull away, he didn't even flinch. Instead, his gaze softened, and for a moment the tension shifted, becoming something different, something softer, more tender. "I know we shouldn't," he replied, his voice low, filled with a raw honesty that made my heart skip a beat. "I know it's wrong, but I can't stop thinking about you. Every time I see you, I can't help but wonder what it would be like if things were different." His words washed over me like a wave, hitting with a force I wasn't ready for. I felt a mix of guilt and something else, something I couldn't quite name but knew was undeniably there. My mind was telling me to stop this, to end it before it went any further, but my body wasn't listening. My pulse raced, my skin tingled under the weight of his words and the unspoken desire that had simmered between us all night. "I've been trying to ignore it," he continued, stepping closer until we were only inches apart. But tonight I can't pretend anymore. His hand reached out hesitantly, brushing against my arm, his touch light as a feather, and I felt my breath hitch again. I was certain he could hear it, and for a brief moment I didn't know what to do. I knew I should put an end to this, but I found myself unable to move. "Michael," I whispered, my voice shaking under the weight of everything I wasn't saying. "This isn't right, I know," he replied, his gaze locked onto mine. "But tell me you don't feel it too. Tell me there's nothing between us." I couldn't. The words wouldn't come because, deep down, I did feel it. I had sensed it all evening, even though I hadn't wanted to acknowledge it. There was something between us, an energy, an attraction, something undeniable. And now that it was out in the open, I couldn't dismiss it, couldn't pretend it didn't exist. The pull between us was too powerful, the air too thick with everything we weren't supposed to feel. He moved even closer, just inches from me now, his breath warm against my skin. I could feel the heat radiating from him, making the air between us stifling, heavy with tension and desire. My mind was spinning, my heart racing, and all the rational thoughts I had were slipping away, replaced by an overwhelming urge to be nearer to him, to feel his touch, to surrender to whatever was happening between us. "I don't want to hurt anyone," he whispered, his hand softly tracing the curve of my arm, leaving a trail of warmth in its wake. "But I can't stop thinking about you." His words sent a thrill through me, and before I could stop myself, I leaned into him, my body responding on its own. His hand slid around my waist, pulling me closer until I could feel the solid warmth of his body pressed against mine. The moment our bodies touched, something inside me broke, and all the resistance I had been clinging to melted away in an instant. "I don't know what we're doing," I murmured, my voice shaky as my hands rested on his chest, feeling the rapid rise and fall of his breath beneath my fingers. "But I can't stop either." His eyes darkened, filled with a mixture of relief and something deeper, more intense. He leaned in, his lips just a breath away from mine, and my skin tingled with anticipation. The air between us crackled with electricity, and in that moment, nothing else mattered, neither the risks nor the consequences. All that mattered was him and the way he made me feel. "I don't want to stop," he whispered against my lips, his breath warm and enticing. "Tell me you don't want to stop." I couldn't say it. I couldn't tell him to stop because truthfully I didn't want him to. I wanted this. I wanted him more than I had ever realized. The temptation, the pull, it was overwhelming, leaving me breathless and unable to think of anything but the need building between us. And then, before I could utter another word, his lips were on mine, soft and warm, sending a wave of heat crashing through me. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, as though he was waiting for me to pull away, to stop him. But I didn't. Instead, I leaned into him, my hands gripping his shirt, pulling him closer as the kiss deepened, growing more intense and urgent. Each second felt like a spark, igniting a fire that had been smoldering beneath the surface, now burning out of control. My hand slid up his chest, feeling the heat of his skin through his shirt, and his arms tightened around me, pulling me impossibly close. The kiss turned from soft and hesitant to something fiercer, filled with all the longing and desire we had been holding back for so long. My breath quickened, and I could feel the weight of his body pressing against mine, solid and unwavering, as though he never wanted to let go. His hands roamed up my sides, making my skin tingle with every touch. My hands were now on his chest, feeling the firmness of his muscles beneath his shirt, and I couldn't stop myself from exploring, my fingers moving to his neck, threading through his hair as I pulled him even closer. The way his lips moved against mine, the way his body pressed into me, it was intoxicating, overwhelming, and I felt like I was losing myself in him, in the heat of the moment. The room around us seemed to vanish, the sounds of the outside world fading into nothing as we became the center of everything. His hands slid lower, down to my hips, gripping me firmly, as if he needed to feel every inch of me. There was a hunger in his touch, a need that matched my own, and I found myself arching into him, desperate to be closer, desperate for more. His lips left mine for a moment, trailing soft kisses down my neck, his breath hot against my skin. I gasped, my fingers tightening in his hair as I tilted my head back, offering him more access, wanting him to continue, to never stop. The feel of his lips on my skin sent waves of heat through my body, awakening something deep inside me that I hadn't felt in a long time. "It's been so hard pretending I don't feel this," he murmured against my skin, his voice thick with emotion, his lips still pressing kisses along my collarbone. "You have no idea how difficult it's been, acting like I don't want you." His words sent a shiver through me, and I couldn't stop the soft moan that escaped my lips. I had felt the same every stolen glance, every brush of his hand had set my heart racing, but I had never dared to admit it. Now, with his hands on me, his lips igniting fire across my skin, it was too real, too intense to ignore any longer. "I feel the same," I whispered, my voice breathless, trembling under the weight of everything we were doing. "I've tried to fight it too, but I can't. Not anymore." The tension between us snapped, and suddenly it was as though all the restraint we had been holding onto shattered. He pulled me closer, his hand slipping under my shirt, his touch burning against my skin. I gasped, my body arching into him as his hands roamed over my back, pulling me flush against him. Every part of me was on fire, my skin tingling with the sensation of his hands, his mouth, his breath. His fingers reached the hem of my shirt, tugging it upward, and without hesitation, I lifted my arms, letting him pull it over my head and toss it aside. The cool air hit my skin briefly before he was on me again, his hands exploring, his lips finding mine once more in a kiss that was hungry and desperate, filled with the need we had been suppressing for so long. I tugged at his shirt, eager to feel him, to touch him, to have nothing between us. He helped me pull it off, and as soon as it hit the floor, I pressed my hands to his bare chest, feeling the warmth of his skin, the steady thrum of his heartbeat beneath my fingertips. His body was firm, strong, and I could feel the tension in his muscles, the way he was holding back, trying to maintain control. But I didn't want him to hold back, I wanted everything. His hands moved to my waist, tracing the curve of my hips before slipping down to the waistband of my jeans. He paused for a moment, his eyes meeting mine, as if asking for permission, waiting for me to stop him. But I didn't. I didn't want to stop, not now, not after everything we had already done. I wanted this. I wanted him. I nodded, my breath catching in my throat as I felt his fingers undo the button of my jeans. He slowly slid them down, his hands grazing my thighs as he pulled them off, leaving me standing there in just my underwear. I felt exposed, vulnerable, but at the same time, more alive than I had in years. He paused for a moment, his eyes wandering over me, taking in every part of my body. The way he looked at me, the intensity in his gaze, made my skin flush with warmth, and I could feel the desire radiating from him in waves. He reached for me again, pulling me into him, his hands on my bare skin, and I felt every inch of him pressed against me. The heat between us was almost unbearable. "God, you're beautiful," he whispered against my lips before kissing me once more, his hands sliding over my back and down to my thighs, lifting me slightly as he pressed me closer to him. I wrapped my arms around his neck, pulling him tighter, my legs trembling from the intensity of the moment. His hands roamed my body with a sort of reverence, as though he was committing every curve, every line, every part of me to memory. I did the same, my fingers tracing the lines of his muscles, feeling the strength in his arms, the warmth of his skin. He kissed me again, slower this time, more deliberate, as if he was savoring the taste of me. His hands moved lower, tracing the edge of my underwear, and I felt my breath catch, my body trembling with anticipation, consumed by the overwhelming need to feel him closer. "Tell me you want this," he murmured against my lips, his voice husky, thick with desire. "Tell me you want me, I want you," I breathed, my voice barely audible. "I need you," that was all he needed to hear. In one smooth motion he lifted me into his arms, carrying me across the room as his lips found mine again, his kisses deep and urgent, filled with the passion we had been holding back for so long. He laid me down gently, his body covering mine, his hands never leaving my skin, as if he couldn't get enough, as if he feared letting go. And then, everything else faded away, the world outside, the lines we had crossed, the consequences that could follow. None of it mattered anymore. All that mattered was how his body felt against mine, the way his hands explored me, the way his lips stayed connected to my skin. We were lost in each other, in the heat of the moment, overwhelmed by everything we had been holding back. Each touch, each kiss, every whispered word sent shivers through me, making me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. Time seemed to stretch, the night slipping away as we explored one another, giving in to the desire that had been building between us for so long. His hands, his lips, his body, they were all I could think about, all I could feel. With every moment, the tension between us grew, the heat intensifying until it was almost too much to bear. We moved together in a rhythm that felt natural, instinctual, as if we had always been meant to find ourselves in this moment. Our bodies intertwined, our breath quickening, our hearts racing in sync, and in that moment I knew there was no turning back. We had crossed a boundary, and we had done it together.